Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughn Manor. And it's Wednesday, which means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, I'll talk about a comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue on his channel will talk about that same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week, usually, depending on whether Steve has all the walls up in his house. He's having some major construction done at his place, so, whether he puts out a video today, it depends on whether he has, walls of floor and electricity. So we'll see. We'll see. But I'm doing it, and today we're talking about Robert E. Howard's adventure character, Solomon Kane. Solomon Kane, Robert E. Howard's Puritan adventurer. So Robert E. Howard famously created Conan the Barbarian, which Marvel made a great comic book about. They also made a comic book about King Kull, Robert E. Howard's other fantasy character. But Robert E. Howard also had this adventure character, Solomon Kane. Now, if you're interested in Solomon Kane, of course, you can get his original adventures in this thrilling volume. This is The Savage Tales of Solomon Kane by Robert E. Howard. This has all of Robert E. Howard's Solomon Kane stories. There were not many of them, but they were pretty much all dynamite. They're great. They're great stories. They are stories that do not take place in a fantasy world like Kull's or Conan's stories do. They take place in a historical world of these late 16th and 17th centuries, but they also do have magic and monsters in them because these stories were originally published in Weird Tales. So they were basically adventure stories that were also horror stories and fantasy stories. So they're great. They're great. And you might not expect a Puritan adventurer. That's not something we usually think of, but Robert E. Howard did, and he came up with a great character. Now, Solomon Kane basically just traveled around righting wrongs and fighting evil. He felt like he had a mission from God to do this, to fight evil in all its forms wherever he came across it. Eventually, he wandered into Africa and had a lot of adventures in Africa. And like I said, they were great. It's a great series of stories. And so naturally, when they were trying to find another character from Robert E. Howard to adapt, they settled on Solomon Kane because he's a great character, had a sword, as you can see, and would fight monsters. So, that's a great character right there. Solomon Kane didn't have his own comic book for a long time. He originally was a backup feature in Savage Sword of Conan, and Kull had a black and white magazine for 5 seconds. I think it was like 4 issues, Kull and the Barbarians. Solomon Kane showed up in that. He also showed up in a color comic book, Marvel Premiere. And eventually, he did show up in a miniseries. So this is an omnibus volume, the original Marvel years of Solomon Kane, that collects all of that stuff. And it's really interesting because this is a very different character from Conan or Kull. He has different concerns. He's obsessed with righting wrongs and fighting evil, which Conan was not. Conan was a pretty self-serving character who did fight evil, when it suited him, but he certainly was a more mercenary character than Solomon Kane was. But Solomon Kane was a great adventure character. This image right here is a pretty great image of Solomon Kane. Usually he had his dark black clothing and slouch hat. Now, there were not many adventures of Solomon Kane, like I said, but Marvel, what Marvel did with Solomon Kane is that they added to his adventures. So this is one of the earlier stories which showed up in a black and white magazine. Which magazine did this show up in? Does it even say? This was from Monsters Unleashed, #1, another black and white magazine. But eventually, he showed up in Dracula Lives, #3. Yeah, that's right. He fought Dracula. In Castle of the Undead, Solomon Kane was made to fight Dracula. Why not? That's actually a pretty good team up. And then eventually he shows up here in Kull and the Barbarians. He's even on the cover there in the corner with Into the Silent City. And this one was actually really good. You had it was kind of a mixed bag, these Solomon Kane stories. This is a story right here that was not based on anything by Robert E. Howard, but it's still extra cool. The stories were actually really good, and they, for the most part, they were a little hit and miss, especially towards the end, but for the most part, they were, especially this Marvel Premiere color issue, which was done by Howard Chaykin, who we don't see too much from anymore, but he's a pretty important comic book artist, Howard Chaykin. Strangely enough, he's mostly known nowadays probably for his adaptation of the Star Wars film. He did the Star Wars movie adaptation, which was really popular. But he also did a bunch of other characters. And he did a great job on Solomon Kane. And so these Solomon Kane issues are kind of standouts for me. This is the Mark of Kane. I mean, the artwork is just really, really good in this issue. And actually, there were a couple issues of Marvel Premiere where he was in it. They just called the series The Mark of Kane with Solomon Kane. But it's a good adaptation because the script is by Roy Thomas, who did so many Conan the Barbarian scripts. And he really does do an excellent job with Solomon Kane. This story and the previous story are based on Red Shadows, which was the first Solomon Kane story that was published. Then we get a bunch of other adaptions of his stories. This is more Howard Chaykin work, but this is from the black and white magazine Savage Sword of Conan. Like I said, he spent a long time being a backup feature in the Savage Sword of Conan, Solomon Kane did. But his comics were pretty much always really interesting. You did have some really interesting artwork. We got some artwork from Sonny Trinidad here in this one, which is a little different. Sonny Trinidad. But you get a bunch of different artists in this volume. A bunch of different artists did the work. We've got one with David Wenzel and Marilitz, whoever that is. There we go. But that's a pretty good page there. This is Retribution in Blood, which was not based on a Robert E. Howard story. Eventually, Solomon Kane appeared again in a color comic book. Let me see if I could find that. He showed up in a miniseries. He ended up having his own 6-issue miniseries. Yeah, this is it right here. Solomon Kane finally got his own comic, but it only lasted a little while. And this was in the 80s, right? Let me see if I could. I should probably check this stuff before I start doing my videos, but of course I never do. Yeah, it was in 1985. And an interesting thing is that when they did this miniseries, they adapted a bunch of stories that they had already adapted in the color comic book and in the black and white comic book. So this adapts Red Shadows, which Howard Chaykin already did. Those color issues I showed you were basically were this story. And so this is just a different version of that story by Ralph Macchio, Steve Carr, and Brett Blevins. And it's a good version. This version is pretty good. I don't think it's as fun as the Howard Chaykin version, but it's still pretty good. It's an interesting thing that they decided to adapt them again, but Marvel did do that. They would sometimes readapt stories that they had already done. They did that with the Tower of the Elephant, the Conan story. And so they did that here too. And so they have a series of Solomon Kane stories, and some are based on Robert E. Howard stories, and some, like this one, are not. But this was actually a pretty solid series. All the issues, they weren't all inked by the same artist. This one has Al Williamson who does it. You have Brett Blevins on pencils, but Al Williamson on the inking. And this is from a story called Blades of the Brotherhood, which was unique among Solomon Kane stories in that it didn't have a supernatural element at all. It was just basically a pirate adventure story. And that doesn't change for this adaptation. And then you have this issue, which is interesting. This is an issue called The Prophet. But it's interesting because it has Mike Mignola art in it. Mike Mignola, who went on to do Hellboy, the Hellboy series of comics, which are just amazing. But this is early Mignola, and so the artwork looks quite a bit different. But you'll see it's pretty darn good. Overall, the quality of the art in this volume, for the most part, is pretty good. There's some artists that are better than others. There's an adaptation of Wings of the Night here, which is the greatest Solomon Kane story. I don't think the artwork in this story is as great as some of the other stories in this volume. It's still good, but I don't think it's as good as some of the other stuff in this volume. But still, a pretty solid adaptation of this story. We do get some extras at the end. We get a weird team up between Cull and Solomon Kane at the end of this story, which is a little odd. It was a later story, probably 1989, somewhere around there. But it was fun. And then you get a bunch of extras at the end of this volume, like you should. You have an article here on Solomon Kane that first appeared in Savage Sword of Conan. We get a couple of those, a couple articles on Solomon Kane. We've got his publishing history up to the point where this was published, and we've got some pinups and sketches and things like that. So overall, this volume is really cool. You'll notice it's a lot shorter than any of the Conan Omnibus volumes or even the Cull Omnibus volumes, because they made 3 Cull Omnibus volumes where they only made one of Solomon Kane, because they did not make that many stories on Solomon Kane. He was the least popular character out of the 3. And that's probably true as far as Robert E. Howard's original stories go. I tend to think that Solomon Kane is a better character than Cull. But, Cull's great also, so, But the stuff that they did do on Solomon Kane was mostly really good. There was some stuff in here that wasn't great. They can't all be winners. And there were some stories with artwork that was just okay. It's serviceable, but a lot of it is okay. But a lot of it is really, really good. I do recommend this volume, particularly if you're interested in this period of Marvel Comics where they were adapting this Robert E. Howard stuff. If you get this in the Cull volumes and the Savage Sword of Conan volumes, you're getting all of that stuff that was published in that magazine for the most part. I think the only thing they can't publish now, well, there's a few things they can't do from that magazine. Red Sonja comes to mind. I don't think Marvel at this moment has the rights to Red Sonja, and they're actually losing the rights to Solomon Kane and all this other stuff from Robert E. Howard. So if you can pick this up, get it while you can. It probably will not be reprinted. In fact, it almost certainly will not be reprinted. But it's an excellent volume, and it's a lot of fun. And if you're a fan of Solomon Kane, you're going to want to get this. So there you go. Solomon Kane, Robert E. Howard, Solomon Kane, the original Marvel years. I've gone on long enough about this volume. Check out Steve Donoghue's video whenever he manages to put it up, and I will catch you next time.